My father-in-law injected our baby with something that made her scream for hours, saying, "Pain tolerance separates the worthy from the weak." I walked into the nursery at 2:18 in the morning because I heard our 4-month-old daughter Sophie crying, but when I opened the door, the scene froze me in place. Gerald Thorne, my wife's father, stood over Sophie's crib with a syringe in his hand, the needle still pressed against her tiny thigh. Sophie's face was purple with agony, her mouth open in a scream so raw it didn't even produce sound at first, just this desperate gasping that made my heart stop. Gerald looked up at me calmly, like he'd been caught doing something mildly embarrassing rather than torturing an infant. He pulled the needle out and set it on the changing table with deliberate precision. "She needs to learn early," he said in that professor voice he used when explaining things to people he considered intellectually inferior. "Pain tolerance separates the worthy from the weak. I'm giving her an advantage most children never receive." I lunged forward and grabbed Sophie from the crib, her tiny body rigid and trembling against my chest. Her skin was burning hot, sweat soaking through her onesie. "What did you inject her with?" My voice came out strangled, barely human. Gerald wiped the injection site on Sophie's leg with an alcohol pad, still moving with that infuriating calm. "A carefully calibrated dose of capsaicin solution," he explained. "Highly concentrated. It causes intense burning pain, but no permanent damage. The body's pain receptors become more efficient after repeated exposure." He said it the way someone might explain a new exercise routine. Sophie finally found her voice and screamed properly, a sound of pure suffering that tore through my chest. I could feel her heart hammering against my palm, too fast, dangerously fast. "You're insane," I said, backing toward the door. "I'm calling an ambulance." Gerald moved between me and the doorway with surprising speed for a man in his 60s. "Think about what you're doing, Ethan," he said. "You call paramedics and tell them what? That I gave my granddaughter a substance that will be out of her system in a few hours? That I was helping her develop resilience? They'll think you're hysterical." His eyes were cold and rational, a scientist observing an experiment. "Your wife asked me to stay the week to help with the baby. She trusts me completely. Who do you think she'll believe?" That stopped me because he was right. My wife Vanessa worshipped her father. Gerald Thorne was a retired biology professor, a published author on evolutionary psychology, a man who'd raised 3 successful children. Vanessa had told me 100 times how her father's unconventional methods had made her stronger, more capable than her peers. I'd thought she meant things educational challenges and high expectations. Now I understood she meant something much darker. "Vanessa!" I shouted, clutching Sophie tighter. "Get in here now!" Footsteps pounded down the hallway, and Vanessa burst into the nursery, her face creased with sleep and confusion. She'd been exhausted from months of interrupted sleep and postpartum recovery. "What's wrong? Why is Sophie screaming?" She reached for our daughter instinctively, but I turned away, keeping Sophie against my chest. "Your father injected her with something," I said. "Some kind of pain compound. He said he's training her to tolerate suffering." The words sounded insane coming out of my mouth, but Sophie's continued screaming and Gerald's calm presence made them undeniable. Vanessa looked at her father with confusion rather than horror. "Dad, what's he talking about?" Gerald's expression softened when he looked at his daughter, the cold scientist persona replaced by something warmer. "I was beginning Sophie's conditioning protocol," he explained gently. "The same protocol I used with you and your siblings when you were infants. You don't remember because you were too young, but I documented everything. The results speak for themselves." He gestured at Vanessa. "You've never backed down from a challenge. You've never let fear or discomfort stop you from achieving your goals. That strength came from early conditioning." Vanessa's face went through several emotions quickly: confusion, disbelief, something that might have been recognition. "You did this to me when I was a baby?" Her voice was small, uncertain. Gerald nodded. "Starting at 3 months old, controlled exposure to pain stimuli, gradually increasing intensity over the first 2 years. It rewires the nervous system's response to suffering. Children who undergo the protocol show remarkable resilience later in life." He pulled a leather-bound journal from his overnight bag. "I kept detailed records. Injection schedules, pain measurements, developmental outcomes. Your success is proof the methodology works. I felt sick listening to him describe systematic infant torture as a scientific achievement. Sophie was still screaming in my arms, her little body shaking with pain. "I'm taking her to the emergency room," I said, moving toward the door again. Gerald didn't try to stop me this time, but his words followed me into the hallway. "The capsaicin will metabolize quickly. By the time a doctor examines her, there'll be no physical evidence except irritation at the injection site. They'll conclude she's colicky or experiencing normal infant distress. Meanwhile, you'll have created a medical record documenting your panic and instability. Think carefully about what you're starting, Ethan." I ignored him and carried Sophie down the stairs, grabbing my phone and keys with my free hand. Vanessa followed, pulling a coat over her pajamas. "Ethan, wait," she said. "If Dad's telling the truth about this being temporary, maybe we should just monitor her at home. Emergency rooms are full of sick people. We could expose her to worse things than whatever Dad gave her." The fact that she was rationalizing her father's actions terrified me more than Gerald's cold justification. "He tortured our baby," I said, stopping at the front door. "He stuck a needle in her and injected something that's making her scream in agony. That's not parenting advice or unconventional methods. That's abuse." Vanessa flinched at the word abuse, but her expression remained uncertain. "Dad wouldn't hurt Sophie. He loves her. If he's telling the truth about doing this with me and my siblings, and we all turned out fine, then maybe there's something to his research." She reached out to stroke Sophie's head, and our daughter's screams had quieted to exhausted whimpering. "She's calming down already. See? Maybe it's not as bad as you think." I stared at my wife, this woman I'd loved for 6 years, and realized Gerald's conditioning had worked exactly as he'd intended. Vanessa couldn't recognize abuse when it was happening to her own child because she'd been trained to accept suffering as beneficial. "Get out of my way," I said quietly. Vanessa stepped aside, tears starting to run down her face. I drove to County Memorial Hospital with Sophie strapped in her car seat, still whimpering and occasionally crying out when the pain spiked. The emergency room was moderately busy for a Thursday night. I checked in at the desk, trying to stay calm while explaining that my infant daughter had been injected with a pain-inducing substance. The triage nurse's expression shifted from concern to skepticism quickly. "Injected by whom?" she asked, typing notes into her computer. "Her grandfather. My father-in-law. He's staying with us and he claims he was conducting some kind of conditioning experiment. He said it was capsaicin, the compound in hot peppers." The nurse called for a physician immediately, and within 5 minutes, Dr. Anita Okonkwo was examining Sophie in a treatment room. She checked the injection site on Sophie's thigh, which showed a small red mark and localized swelling. Sophie had quieted significantly, reduced to occasional hiccuping sobs. Dr. Okonkwo listened to her heart and lungs, checked her temperature and reflexes. "Her vitals are normal now," she said. "Heart rate's a bit elevated but coming down. The injection site shows minor inflammation consistent with a recent needle stick, but there's no obvious infection or severe reaction." She looked at me with careful professional neutrality. "Can you tell me exactly what you witnessed?" I explained everything: Gerald's calm explanation, his journal of conditioning protocols, his admission that he'd done this to his own children. Dr. Okonkwo took notes, her expression growing more concerned. "I'm going to order blood work to see if we can identify what substance was administered," she said. "Given the circumstances you're describing, I'm also required to file a report with Child Protective Services." That's when Vanessa arrived with her father. I heard their voices in the hallway outside the treatment room before they entered. Gerald's calm tenor explaining something, Vanessa's distressed responses. Then they pushed through the curtain, and I instinctively moved between them and Sophie. Dr. Okonkwo held up a hand. "I'm going to need to speak with everyone separately," she said. "Mr. Thorne, are you the individual who administered an injection to this infant?" Gerald nodded calmly. "I am. I gave Sophie a subcutaneous injection of a diluted capsaicin solution at approximately 2:15 this morning. The concentration was carefully calculated based on her body weight and development stage. As I explained to my son-in-law, this is part of a conditioning protocol I've researched and applied successfully with my own children." Dr. Okonkwo's professional mask cracked slightly, showing the horror underneath. You intentionally injected a 4-month-old baby with a pain-inducing substance? Why? Gerald pulled out his leather journal and opened it to a page filled with charts and notes. I've spent 40 years studying pain response and resilience development. Early exposure to controlled suffering creates neural pathways that make individuals more capable of handling stress, adversity, and discomfort throughout life. I have 3 children who underwent this protocol, all highly successful adults with exceptional pain tolerance and emotional resilience. He spoke with the confidence of someone presenting peer-reviewed research. The capsaicin causes temporary intense discomfort but no tissue damage. Within hours, the effects completely subside. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice shaking. Dad, I need to know the truth. Did you really do this to me when I was a baby? Gerald met his daughter's eyes with something approaching tenderness. I did, and look at you now. You completed your medical degree while working full-time. You've never let physical discomfort stop you from achieving your goals. Vanessa's face went pale. I have anxiety disorder and chronic pain. I've been in therapy for years, trying to understand why I have such a high tolerance for suffering, why I stay in situations that hurt me because I think I should be strong enough to handle it. Her voice broke. I thought that was just my personality. Was it you? Did you condition me to accept pain? Gerald's expression didn't change. I gave you strength. The fact that you sometimes struggle with anxiety is unrelated to the protocol. That's genetic predisposition, not a result of early conditioning. He turned to Dr. Okonkwo. I'm happy to provide you with my complete research. 40 years of documentation showing positive outcomes. This isn't abuse, it's advanced developmental methodology. Dr. Okonkwo's jaw was tight with controlled anger. Mr. Thorne, intentionally inflicting pain on an infant is child abuse regardless of your rationalization. You're not a licensed physician, and even if you were, this would violate every ethical standard in medicine. She turned to the nurse at the door. Security needs to escort Mr. Thorne from the hospital immediately. He's not to have any contact with the patient. Gerald allowed himself to be led away without protest, but his parting words chilled me. This won't end here, Ethan. Vanessa knows I'm right. She'll come to understand that I was helping Sophie, not hurting her. You're the one creating trauma by overreacting to a proven developmental technique. After he left, Dr. Okonkwo arranged for Sophie to be admitted overnight for observation. The blood work would take hours, and she wanted to monitor for any delayed reactions. Vanessa and I sat in the pediatric ward in silence, our daughter sleeping fitfully in the hospital crib between us. Did you know? I finally asked. About any of this? Vanessa shook her head, tears streaming silently down her face. I knew Dad had unconventional ideas about parenting. He always talked about toughness and resilience, but I thought that meant cold showers and high expectations, not injecting babies with pain compounds. She looked at Sophie's sleeping face. I need to talk to my brother and sister. Find out if they remember anything, if they've had similar experiences. She pulled out her phone and stepped into the hallway. I sat with Sophie, watching her chest rise and fall, her tiny fists clenched even in sleep. The injection site on her thigh had a purple bruise forming around it. The blood results came back at 6:30 in the morning, showing elevated stress hormones and traces of capsaicinoids, confirming Gerald's admission. Dr. Okonkwo explained that CPS would be conducting an investigation, that Gerald would be prohibited from contact with Sophie pending the outcome. She gave me the contact information for a CPS investigator named Derek Wu, who would be reaching out within 24 hours. Vanessa returned, looking shaken. I talked to my sister Claudia. She doesn't remember specific incidents, but she said she's always had this weird thing where pain doesn't bother her the way it bothers other people. She broke her arm in college and walked around with it for 3 days before going to the doctor. Vanessa sat down heavily. My brother Thomas said he's been in therapy for years dealing with something his therapist calls emotional numbing. He can't form normal attachments because he was conditioned to view vulnerability as weakness. She looked at me with devastation in her eyes. What did Dad do to us? We took Sophie home that afternoon with instructions to monitor for any delayed reactions and keep her away from Gerald indefinitely. I thought that would be the end of it. that the CPS investigation would result in charges, and Gerald would be kept away from our family. I was wrong. Derek Wu, the CPS investigator, visited our home 3 days later. He was a tired-looking man in his 40s who'd probably seen too many genuine abuse cases to be easily shocked. He interviewed Vanessa and me separately, examined Sophie thoroughly, and reviewed the hospital records. When he finished, his conclusion was frustrating. "This is an unusual case," he said carefully. "Mr. Thorne admits to administering the injection and provides documentation of his methodology. The hospital confirms capsaicin was present in the infant's system, but there's no lasting physical harm. From a legal standpoint, this falls into a gray area." I stared at him in disbelief. He tortured a baby. How is that a gray area? Wu sighed. "Because he's the child's grandfather. There's no evidence of sexual abuse or intent to cause permanent injury, and he has documentation framing this as a developmental technique. Defense attorneys would argue this was misguided parenting advice rather than criminal abuse." He closed his folder. "I'm documenting this incident, and Gerald Thorne will be flagged in our system. If there are any future reports involving him and children, this will be taken into account. But I don't have sufficient evidence to recommend charges or restrict his parental rights regarding other family members." Vanessa looked relieved. "So Dad's not going to jail?" He made a mistake, but he thought he was helping. The fact that she was defending him made my blood run cold. Wu held up a hand. "I'm recommending that Mr. Thorne have no unsupervised contact with Sophie until she's at least school-aged and can report her own experiences. I'm also recommending family therapy to address the concerning beliefs about pain conditioning." After Wu left, Vanessa and I had our first serious fight since Sophie's birth. "Your father tortured our baby and you're acting like it was a parenting disagreement," I said, trying to keep my voice level. Vanessa's face flushed with anger and confusion. "He made a terrible mistake, yes, but he genuinely believed he was helping. He's not some sadistic monster. He's my father and he loves Sophie." She picked up Gerald's research journal, which CPS had allowed him to keep after copying relevant pages. There are decades of notes in here, detailed observations about pain response development. This wasn't random cruelty, it was misguided research. I wanted to grab the journal and throw it in the fireplace, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Vanessa, listen to yourself. You're defending a man who injected our baby with a pain compound and watched her scream for hours. The fact that he took notes while doing it makes it worse, not better." She set the journal down carefully. "I'm not defending what he did. I'm saying I understand why he did it. He thinks suffering builds character. He's wrong, but his intentions weren't evil." She paused. "And honestly, Ethan, I turned out fine. Maybe his methods are extreme, but Claudia, Thomas, and I are all functional adults." The word functional echoed in my head. Vanessa's sister couldn't recognize her own pain. Her brother couldn't form emotional attachments. Vanessa had been conditioned to tolerate suffering to the point where she couldn't identify abuse. These weren't positive outcomes. They were symptoms of deep trauma. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched helplessly as Gerald slowly worked his way back into our lives. He called Vanessa daily, apologizing for distressing her but maintaining that his methodology was sound. He sent articles about pain tolerance research and neural plasticity. He arranged for Vanessa to speak with a colleague of his, a neuroscientist who talked about how early stress exposure could enhance resilience. Vanessa started mentioning that maybe Gerald's approach had some merit, that perhaps we were being too rigid in our thinking. "The CPS investigation found no grounds for charges," she said one evening while feeding Sophie. "Dad's agreed to family therapy and to never give Sophie any injections without our explicit consent. Maybe we can find a middle ground." I looked at my wife holding our daughter, and I realized she'd been so thoroughly conditioned by Gerald's abuse that she couldn't see it clearly. To her, what happened was a mistake in execution rather than a fundamental violation. That night, I started researching Gerald Thorne. His published academic work focused on evolutionary psychology and human resilience. He'd written 3 books about adaptive stress response and had a devoted following in certain unconventional parenting circles. But I also found things he hadn't publicized. His first wife, Vanessa's mother, had died in a hiking accident when Vanessa was 12. The accident report mentioned that she'd fallen from a cliff while experiencing what was described as a panic attack. Witnesses said she'd been behaving erratically, claiming her husband was dangerous. The coroner ruled it accidental death with possible mental health factors. Gerald's second wife had divorced him after only 2 years, citing irreconcilable differences. I tracked her down through social media and sent a carefully worded message asking if she'd be willing to talk about Gerald's parenting philosophy. She called me within an hour. "You need to get your family away from him," she said without preamble. Her name was Lillian Cross, and her voice shook with intensity. "I divorced Gerald when I discovered what he'd done to his children. He showed me his journals like they were something to be proud of. Decades of documentation about inflicting pain on infants and toddlers, tracking their reactions, measuring their crying duration. He called it research. I called it torture." She took a shaky breath. "I tried to report him to authorities, but he had documentation framing everything as developmental intervention. His kids defended him because they'd been conditioned to view the abuse as beneficial. I couldn't make anyone understand how dangerous he was." I asked her about Vanessa's mother. Lillian was quiet for a long moment. Margaret started to see the truth about what Gerald had done to their children. She'd been complicit initially, believing his academic credentials and research. But as Vanessa and her siblings got older, Margaret recognized the trauma they carried. She was planning to leave Gerald and take the kids. 2 weeks later, she died in that hiking accident. Lillian's voice dropped. "I can't prove Gerald killed her. The investigation cleared him. But I've always known Margaret wouldn't have panicked on that cliff. She'd been hiking those trails for years. But if someone told her something that made her realize the full scope of what had been done to her children, if she understood that her husband had systematically tortured them for years while she stood by and allowed it, that might cause the kind of psychological break witnesses described." After that call, I couldn't sleep. I watched Gerald's patterns over the next weeks as he gradually normalized his presence in our home again. Vanessa invited him for Sunday dinner. He brought gifts for Sophie, expensive educational toys and books about child development. He never mentioned the injection, but he watched Sophie constantly with those cold, assessing eyes. During one dinner, I caught him checking his phone and making notes. When I asked what he was documenting, he smiled and said he was tracking Sophie's developmental milestones. Completely normal grandfather behavior, except I'd seen his journals. I knew his milestone tracking involved pain tolerance measurements. I confronted Vanessa that night after Gerald left. "Your father is planning to continue his experiments. He's waiting for our guard to drop, for things to normalize, and then he'll find another opportunity to inject Sophie with something or expose her to some other pain stimulus." Vanessa was washing dishes, her movements aggressive. "You're becoming paranoid, Ethan. Dad made one terrible mistake and he's apologized. The therapy sessions are helping him understand why his methods were wrong. You need to let this go before you damage our family permanently." That's when I realized Vanessa would never fully protect Sophie from Gerald. Her conditioning was too deep. She would always find ways to rationalize her father's behavior, to minimize the abuse, to maintain the belief that his intentions were good even when his actions were monstrous. I needed proof so undeniable that even Vanessa couldn't explain it away. I installed hidden cameras throughout our house, focusing on areas where Gerald spent time with Sophie. I told Vanessa I was upgrading our security system, and she didn't question it. The cameras had audio recording and motion-activated alerts that would notify my phone immediately if Gerald entered Sophie's nursery or any room where she was alone. For 3 weeks, nothing suspicious happened. Gerald visited regularly, always appropriate, always supervised. I started to wonder if I was actually becoming paranoid, if the trauma of that night had distorted my perception. Then Vanessa's sister, Claudia, had a medical emergency that required surgery. Vanessa drove 4 hours to be with her sister, leaving me home with Sophie. She asked if Gerald could stay with us to help with the baby while she was gone. I refused, and we fought bitterly before she left. 2 days into Vanessa's absence, Gerald showed up at our house at 7 in the evening. "I thought you might need help with Sophie," he said pleasantly. "Single parenting is exhausting. I brought dinner from that Italian place you like." Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door in his face, but I was curious what he'd try with Vanessa gone. I let him in, keeping Sophie in my arms the entire time. We ate the Italian food he'd brought, making awkward conversation. Gerald asked about my work as a software engineer, about my parents, about everything except the injection incident. After dinner, he offered to hold Sophie while I cleaned up. I refused, taking her with me into the kitchen while Gerald sat in the living room. That's when I noticed he'd left his messenger bag on our couch, partially open. Inside, I could see the leather journal and what looked like a small insulated case. My phone buzzed. The motion-activated camera in the living room was sending an alert. I pulled up the live feed and watched Gerald reach into his bag and remove a syringe and small vial. He was preparing another injection while I was in the next room. I walked back into the living room with Sophie still in my arms. "What's that?" I asked, pointing at the syringe now lying openly on the coffee table. Gerald didn't try to hide it. "A booster dose," he said calmly. The initial capsaicin injection was a baseline assessment. To properly condition pain tolerance, Sophie needs graduated exposure over time. This dose is slightly more concentrated than the first. I calculated it based on her current weight and development. He reached for Sophie. "It will only take a moment." I backed away toward the door. "You're not touching her." Gerald stood up slowly, his expression hardening. "Ethan, you're being irrational. This is necessary for Sophie's development. Vanessa will understand once I explain the protocol properly. She's starting to remember her own conditioning, starting to appreciate the strength it gave her." He took a step forward. "You can either cooperate or you can fight me. Either way, Sophie's training will continue. I've dedicated my life to this research. One misguided father won't stop decades of work." I pulled out my phone and called 911, keeping it on speaker. "I need police at 1847 Oakmont Drive. My father-in-law is attempting to assault my infant daughter with a syringe containing a pain-inducing substance." The dispatcher's voice came through clearly, asking for details. Gerald lunged forward, trying to grab the phone. We crashed into the coffee table, and I heard the syringe shatter on the floor. Sophie started crying as I fell backward, using my body to shield her from the impact. Gerald was stronger than I expected for a man in his 60s, decades of hiking and research. Fieldwork had kept him fit. He pinned my arm that was holding the phone, trying to end the call. "The subject is Gerald Thorne," I shouted toward the phone. "He's admitted to injecting my daughter with capsaicin 3 weeks ago. He's trying to do it again. He has syringes and vials in his messenger bag." Gerald's hand clamped over my mouth, but the dispatcher had heard enough. I could hear her voice saying police were en route. Estimated arrival 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes felt eternal. Gerald sat on my chest with his hand over my mouth, Sophie crying on the floor next to us where I'd carefully placed her during the struggle. "You're going to ruin everything," Gerald hissed. His calm professor demeanor was completely gone, replaced by cold fury. 40 years of research, 3 successful case studies. Sophie could have been the 4th, demonstrating the protocol's replicability. Instead, you'll get me arrested and destroy data that could revolutionize childhood development. I bit down on his palm hard enough to draw blood. He jerked back, and I rolled away, grabbing Sophie and stumbling toward the front door. Blue and red lights were already visible through the window. 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop in our driveway. Gerald stood in our living room breathing hard, blood dripping from his hand onto our carpet. He looked at me with something beyond anger, a cold assessment that made me think of Lillian's words about Vanessa's mother. "This won't end the way you think it will," he said quietly. "Vanessa will forgive me. She'll understand I was trying to help. And someday, when Sophie is older, she'll thank me for the strength I tried to give her. You'll be the one left isolated, the paranoid father who couldn't appreciate advanced developmental science." The police entered with weapons drawn, responding to the dispatcher's report of an assault in progress. They found Gerald standing calmly in the living room, me at the door with Sophie, and the shattered syringe on the floor. One officer secured Gerald, while the other checked on Sophie and me. I showed them the cameras I'd installed, pulling up the footage of Gerald preparing the injection. The video was crystal clear, showing him removing the syringe and vial from his bag, drawing liquid from the vial, and preparing to inject Sophie. The audio captured his admission about this being a booster dose for pain tolerance conditioning. The officer watching the footage looked sick. "Mr. Thorne, you're under arrest for attempted assault of a minor and child endangerment." As they handcuffed him, Gerald remained eerily calm. "I'm a retired professor with 4 decades of published research in developmental psychology. What you're interpreting as assault is actually a carefully designed intervention protocol. I have documentation proving the safety and efficacy of graduated pain exposure for resilience building. The officer wasn't impressed. You can explain that to a judge. Right now, you're going to county jail. They took him away while the second officer stayed to take my detailed statement. Vanessa called while I was mid-interview, having received an alert from our security system about police activity. I told her what happened, expecting relief or horror. Instead, I got silence. "Vanessa?" I prompted. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was cold. "You set him up. You installed cameras and provoked him into coming over, knowing I was gone. You wanted to get him arrested." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "He came here planning to inject Sophie again. I didn't provoke anything. I protected our daughter." Vanessa's laugh was bitter. "You've been trying to destroy my father since the first incident. You can't accept that his methods, while unconventional, might actually have merit. Now you've gotten him arrested and created a permanent record that will destroy his reputation and research." She was crying now. "I'm staying with Claudia until I figure out what to do. I can't be with someone who would do this to my family." She hung up before I could respond. The officer taking my statement looked uncomfortable. "Family situations are complicated," he offered. "The important thing is your daughter is safe." But Sophie wasn't safe, not really, because her mother was conditioned to protect her abuser rather than her child. Over the next days, the situation spiraled. Gerald was charged with attempted assault on a minor, child endangerment, and possession of controlled substances with intent to harm. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman named Diana Reeves, was horrified by the details. "This is one of the most disturbing cases I've handled," she told me during our preparation meeting. "The systematic nature of the abuse, the documentation, the complete lack of remorse. Mr. Thorne genuinely believes he was helping these children." She reviewed Gerald's journals, which had been seized as evidence. "He's documented administering pain stimuli to his 3 children over 200 times in their first 2 years of life. Injections, ice baths, controlled electric shocks using a modified TENS unit. He tracked their pain response times, crying duration, and recovery rates. This is torture disguised as research." She looked at me seriously. "Your wife grew up viewing this abuse as normal. Her testimony might actually help the defense if she frames her father's actions as beneficial parenting." Vanessa hired a lawyer and filed for separation. Her attorney argued that my installation of hidden cameras and alleged provocation of Gerald constituted manipulative behavior designed to alienate her from her family. The separation papers requested primary custody of Sophie, with supervised visitation for me pending psychological evaluation. Gerald's defense attorney was expensive and competent. He framed the case as academic freedom and unconventional parenting practices rather than criminal abuse. He presented Gerald's published research, testimonials from parents who'd attended his seminars on resilience building, and character witnesses from the university where he'd taught. He even got Vanessa to testify about how her father's methods had made her successful and capable. I sat in the courtroom watching my wife defend the man who tortured her as an infant. She couldn't see it because the conditioning was too complete. Gerald had spent her entire childhood teaching her that pain was strength, that suffering built character, that his abuse was love. The prosecutor called experts in child psychology and trauma, who explained that Gerald's methods constituted systematic abuse regardless of his academic credentials. They detailed the long-term psychological damage caused by early pain conditioning, the inability to form secure attachments, the distorted relationship with suffering that Vanessa exhibited. But the defense countered with their own experts, who talked about stress inoculation theory and hormetic stress, twisting legitimate research to justify Gerald's torture. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I testified about both incidents, the initial injection and the attempted second one. The jury watched the security footage of Gerald preparing the syringe and admitting his intentions. They heard his own words about Sophie's training, continuing regardless of my objections. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. Gerald was sentenced to 8 years in prison, though his lawyers immediately filed appeals. The judge's words during sentencing were scathing. "Mr. Thorne, you used your academic credentials to justify systematic torture of helpless infants, including your own children and grandchild. You documented this abuse meticulously and called it research. The victims of your crimes defend you because you conditioned them to view suffering as beneficial. This makes your crimes even more heinous, not less. You broke the fundamental trust between caregiver and child, and you did it in the name of science. But the legal victory felt hollow because I was losing my family. Vanessa refused to acknowledge that Gerald's conviction proved anything except judicial bias against unconventional parenting. She moved forward with the divorce, fighting for primary custody. Her lawyer argued that I'd demonstrated paranoid and controlling behavior, that my obsession with proving Gerald's guilt had created an unstable home environment. The custody evaluation was brutal. A psychologist named Dr. Raymond Chu interviewed both of us extensively and observed our interactions with Sophie. He asked Vanessa about her childhood, about her father's methods, about her own experience with pain. Her answers were disturbing to anyone listening objectively, but she delivered them with complete conviction. "My father taught me to be strong," she said. "I don't shy away from challenges because I learned early that discomfort is temporary, but growth is permanent. That's a gift most people never receive." Dr. Chu asked if she considered the pain inflicted on her as an infant to be abuse. Vanessa hesitated. By conventional standards, maybe, but conventional parenting produces conventional results. My siblings and I are exceptional because Dad refused to be conventional. When Dr. Chu asked if she would allow Gerald to have contact with Sophie after his release from prison, Vanessa said, "I would consider supervised visits, once Sophie is old enough to understand and benefit from Grandpa's wisdom." That answer should have been enough to deny her custody, but family court is complicated. Dr. Chu's report acknowledged Vanessa's concerning beliefs, but noted that she'd been a competent mother in all observable ways. She fed Sophie properly, maintained appropriate sleep schedules, sought medical care when needed. Her ability to parent day-to-day was unimpaired even if her underlying philosophy was disturbing. The recommendation was joint custody with me having primary physical custody until Sophie was school-aged, at which point the arrangement would be reevaluated. Vanessa would have regular visitation, but would be prohibited from allowing Gerald any contact with Sophie, supervised or otherwise. Vanessa appealed the custody decision, which dragged out for another 6 months. During that time, I had Sophie full-time while Vanessa had supervised weekend visits. I watched my daughter grow and develop normally, wondering constantly what damage might have been done by that one injection, what neural pathways might have been altered by hours of chemically induced agony. Sophie seemed happy and healthy, but I couldn't shake the fear that Gerald's poison had left invisible scars. I also started tracking Gerald's other victims. Through Lillian's help, I connected with parents who'd attended Gerald's seminars and implemented his pain conditioning protocols with their own children. Some defended the practice, claiming their children showed enhanced resilience. Others had come to recognize it as abuse and were dealing with the aftermath. One father, a man named Christopher Lang, had followed Gerald's protocols exactly as documented. His twin sons had undergone graduated pain exposure starting at 4 months old. By age 8, both boys showed concerning symptoms: emotional detachment, high pain tolerance that led to ignoring injuries, and difficulty forming peer relationships. Christopher's wife had left him, taking the boys and cutting off all contact. "I destroyed my family following Gerald Thorne's research," Christopher told me over coffee. His eyes were haunted. "I thought I was giving my sons an advantage. Instead, I taught them that people who love you will hurt you, that suffering is normal, that vulnerability is weakness." He pulled out his phone and showed me photos of his sons. "They're teenagers now. They barely speak to me. My ex-wife's lawyer sent me a letter saying the boys are in intensive therapy trying to undo the damage I did. All because I believed Gerald's credentials and documentation rather than trusting my instincts that hurting babies was wrong." I shared Christopher's story with the prosecutor's office, which was building a case against Gerald's broader activities. They discovered he'd sold his protocols as consulting services to over 50 families, earning substantial income from parents willing to pay for his expertise in creating resilient children. Some of those children were now adolescents or young adults with documented psychological problems. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation into Gerald's consulting business and whether he'd violated laws regarding practicing medicine without a license or child endangerment on a broader scale. Gerald's appeals failed, and he began serving his 8-year sentence. From prison, he started a blog about academic persecution and the suppression of innovative research. He framed himself as a martyr to scientific truth, persecuted by a society too weak to embrace difficult methodologies. His writings attracted a following of people who believed conventional parenting was failing children. That modern society was producing weak adults who couldn't handle adversity. Some of his supporters started their own pain conditioning experiments with their children. I reported every case I became aware of to authorities, but the legal system moved slowly. Some states had clear laws against child abuse that covered these practices. Others had gray areas that defense attorneys exploited. The movement Gerald had started continued spreading even with him behind bars. Sophie turned 2 during this nightmare period. She was a happy toddler who loved books and music and had no memory of her grandfather's attack. Vanessa's visitation had stabilized into a routine, though there was always tension between us. She'd stopped actively defending Gerald's methods, but also refused to condemn them. She existed in a state of willful ambiguity, acknowledging the court's findings, but not fully accepting them. Then, everything changed again. Vanessa's brother Thomas reached out to me requesting a meeting. We'd never been close. Thomas was 31, a successful architect who seemed emotionally distant, but functional. We met at a quiet restaurant, and Thomas looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "I need to tell you something about Dad," he started. His hands were shaking around his coffee cup. "Something I've never told anyone, including Vanessa and Claudia." He pulled out a folder containing medical records and therapy notes. "I've been working with a trauma specialist for 3 years, trying to understand why I can't form intimate relationships, why I feel nothing when I should feel pain or fear or love." Thomas opened the folder and showed me documentation of his conditioning history. I remembered more than my sisters about what Dad did. I was older when the worst of it happened. The pain experiments didn't stop at age 2. They continued until I was 6, just less frequently and more sophisticated. He showed me a journal entry in Gerald's handwriting describing an experiment when Thomas was 5. Gerald had used pressure point manipulation and controlled burns to test pain tolerance, documenting Thomas's responses in clinical detail. "Dad told me I was special," Thomas continued, "that I was his proof of concept, the child who would demonstrate the full potential of his methodology. He said the pain made me strong, that other kids were weak and I was superior." His voice broke. I believed him. I thought my inability to feel emotions properly was strength. I didn't realize until therapy that Dad had broken something fundamental in me. Thomas looked at me directly. "Dad's appeals are ongoing. His lawyer is good, and there's a chance he could get his sentence reduced or overturned on technical grounds. If that happens, he'll come after Sophie again. Not immediately, not obviously, but eventually. He views her as his legacy project, the grandchild who will validate decades of research." He pushed the folder toward me. "I'm testifying against him in the Attorney General's investigation. I'm going public with what he did to me, but I need you to protect Sophie in ways the legal system can't. Dad is patient and obsessive. Prison won't change him." I thanked Thomas for his courage in coming forward and asked what made him finally decide to speak up. His answer was simple. "I met someone, a woman who tried to love me and couldn't understand why I was incapable of being vulnerable with her. She asked me when I'd learned to be so afraid of feeling things." That question broke through decades of conditioning. Thomas's testimony was devastating. He described specific incidents of torture in clinical detail, showed medical records of injuries Gerald had called training accidents, provided his own childhood journals where he'd written about being special and strong while describing obvious symptoms of trauma. The Attorney General's expanded case against Gerald resulted in additional charges. More families came forward with stories of children damaged by his protocols. The investigation revealed Gerald had been aware his methods caused psychological harm, but had viewed it as an acceptable trade-off for enhanced pain tolerance. His private notes, seized from storage units and his home office, were filled with observations about emotional detachment and relationship difficulties in his subjects, but he'd framed these as minor side effects rather than serious damage. The public attention forced institutions to examine their complicity. The university where Gerald had taught launched an investigation into how he'd been allowed to publish research based on child abuse. Academic journals retracted 3 of his papers. His books were pulled from publication. Professional organizations that had once celebrated his work on resilience now condemned him. But none of that protected Sophie from the true danger, which was her mother's inability to fully reject her father's philosophy. Vanessa watched Thomas's testimony and saw her brother describe the same childhood experiences she'd had, but where Thomas recognized trauma, Vanessa still saw complicated parenting. The cognitive dissonance was destroying her. She started showing up to custody exchanges looking exhausted and haunted. During one visit, she broke down crying while Sophie played in the next room. "I don't know what's real anymore," Vanessa said. "Thomas says Dad tortured us. The courts say Dad tortured us. But I remember feeling proud when I didn't cry during Dad's training sessions. I remember him telling me I was stronger than other kids. Was that abuse, or was I actually learning valuable skills?" She looked at me with desperate confusion. How do I separate the trauma from the truth? What if Dad was right about some things, even if his methods were wrong? I wanted to tell her there was no truth in Gerald's methods, that any benefits were vastly outweighed by the damage. But Vanessa needed to reach that conclusion herself, or she'd never fully protect Sophie. I suggested she work with Thomas's trauma specialist, Dr. Yolanda Freeman. Vanessa resisted initially, but after another sleepless week wrestling with her memories, she agreed. Over the following months, Dr. Freeman helped Vanessa process what had been done to her. The therapy was brutal, forcing Vanessa to confront memories she'd reframed as character-building experiences and recognize them as abuse. She grieved for the childhood she'd lost, for the mother who'd died before she could protect her children, for the fundamental betrayal of having a parent who viewed you as an experimental subject rather than a person to nurture. The breakthrough came when Dr. Freeman asked Vanessa to imagine Sophie at age 4 undergoing one of Gerald's training sessions. Vanessa had a panic attack visualizing her daughter experiencing what she'd experienced. That visceral reaction finally broke through the conditioning. She could accept for herself what Gerald had done, but she couldn't accept it for Sophie. That was enough. Vanessa called me after that session, her voice raw from crying. "I understand now why you fought so hard. Why you installed cameras and got Dad arrested. You were protecting Sophie from what happened to me." She took a shaky breath. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I put you through a custody battle when you were the only one actually keeping our daughter safe." She paused. "I want to try again. Not the marriage necessarily, but co-parenting. Real co-parenting where we're both committed to protecting Sophie from Dad and his ideas." We started family therapy together, working through the trauma of the past 2 years and building a foundation for cooperative parenting. It was slow and difficult, with setbacks when Vanessa's old conditioning resurfaced. But she was committed to changing, to recognizing the abuse for what it was. Gerald's final appeal was denied, and his sentence was extended after the Attorney General's investigation resulted in 15 additional counts of child endangerment related to his consulting work. He would spend at least 20 years in prison, by which time he'd be in his 80s, and Sophie would be an adult capable of making her own decisions about contact. I received a letter from Gerald 6 months after his final appeal failed. It was written in his characteristic careful handwriting on prison stationery. The content was chilling in its complete lack of insight or remorse. "Ethan, you've won the legal battle, but you're losing the war that matters. Sophie will grow up soft and unprepared for real adversity. When life inevitably hurts her, when she faces suffering she can't handle because you kept her protected and weak, you'll remember that I offered her strength. History will vindicate my research. The children I trained will outlast and outperform their peers. That's the ultimate proof of methodology's value." I showed the letter to Dr. Freeman during our next family session. She read it and shook her head sadly. "Gerald Thorne has spent so many decades justifying his abuse to himself that he's incapable of recognizing it. He's constructed an entire worldview where torturing children is scientific advancement. Prison won't change that." She looked at Vanessa and me. "The best thing you can do is raise Sophie with normal, healthy attachments. Teach her that pain is a warning signal, not a training tool. Show her that vulnerability is connection, not weakness. Let her grow up knowing she's loved unconditionally, not because of her pain tolerance or resilience, but simply because she exists." We did exactly that. Sophie is now 5 years old, starting kindergarten next month. She's a bright, emotionally open child, who forms easy friendships and knows she's safe and loved. She has no memory of her grandfather or the night he hurt her. We'll tell her the truth when she's old enough to understand it, but for now, she gets to be simply a child. Vanessa has continued therapy and has become an advocate for recognizing and treating childhood conditioning trauma. She speaks at conferences about how abuse disguised as parenting methodology can deceive even the victims. Her relationship with her siblings has deepened as all three work through their shared trauma. Thomas still struggles with emotional connection, but he's in a stable relationship with someone who understands his history. Claudia has learned to recognize her own pain and seek appropriate medical care. Both have cut off all contact with Gerald. Last month, one of Gerald's former consulting clients reached out to me. Her teenage son had been subjected to pain conditioning as an infant and was now in psychiatric care dealing with severe emotional disorders. She was part of a class action lawsuit against Gerald's estate, seeking damages for the harm done to children who underwent his protocols. I testified as part of that case, describing what Gerald had attempted with Sophie and the systematic nature of his methodology. The lawsuit succeeded, resulting in a substantial settlement that would fund therapy and medical care for Gerald's victims. The money won't undo the damage, but it acknowledges the harm and provides resources for healing. Sophie runs through our backyard chasing fireflies on summer evenings, laughing with pure joy at simple things. She cries when she's hurt and seeks comfort, exactly as children should. She's learning that the people who love her will protect her, not harm her in the name of making her stronger. That's the real strength Gerald never understood. Not the ability to tolerate suffering, but the courage to be vulnerable, to connect with others, to feel pain and seek healing rather than numbing yourself to survive. Sophie has that courage because Vanessa and I chose to protect her softness rather than harden it through abuse. Gerald Thorne's research is now taught in psychology courses as a case study in how credentials and documentation can disguise systematic child abuse, how perpetrators can convince themselves they're helping while destroying lives. His name is synonymous with the dangers of treating children as experimental subjects rather than humans worthy of protection and love. That's his legacy, not the enhanced resilience he claimed to create. Years from now, when Sophie asks about the grandfather she never knew, we'll tell her the truth. That he was a man who confused strength with the absence of feeling, who mistook trauma for training. We'll tell her that real strength is allowing yourself to be fully human, experiencing joy and pain and love and fear without numbing any of it. And we'll tell her that she's strong not because anyone hurt her into it, but because she was loved enough to be protected from those who would try. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.